Welcome to Catholic Mystery, where we open up the Scriptures and the mystery of our Catholic faith. In this video, we'll continue looking at Matthew 24, verses 29 through 31, perhaps the most confusing verses in the Gospel. We'll use a Catholic way to unpack their meaning and learn about angels and trumpets. Join us and explore the mystery of the end times. We've been walking through Matthew 24, a set of verses that many Christians believe is a future oracle or prophecy about the end of the world and Christ's second coming. And one of the reasons is because of these three verses right here. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. This image of all the tribes of the earth mourning might bring to mind the entire planet undergoing the judgment of the Son of Man. And these angels and this loud trumpet call might bring to mind visible angels blowing trumpets to announce Christ's return. And so it's reasonable for modern readers to assume these verses are about Christ's second coming. But they're not. At least not in the sense we might expect. We'll take a look at this imagery of mourning, angels, and trumpets, and ask three questions about them. Number one, what is the meaning of the phrase, all the tribes of the earth will mourn? Number two, what does it mean that the Son of Man will send out his angels? Number three, what is this reference to a loud trumpet call? Let's address our first question, namely, what is the meaning of the phrase, all the tribes of the earth will mourn? As discussed in our series, the Catholic approach is to first determine what the Church calls the primary literal sense of a text. When the Church uses the term literal, she doesn't mean what modern readers think it means in our modern culture, in our modern language. The literal sense means what the human authors of the Bible intended to convey to the audience of their time and culture. So we ask the question, how would a first century Jew have understood this language? And so we need to look to the Old Testament to get that sense. But more importantly, as we learned in our last video, we also have to read these verses in context and not in isolation. And what we mean by context is the rest of the verses that surround the passages we are studying. These verses of Matthew are included in a very, very long prophecy about the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, which was fulfilled in 70 AD. We need to understand these phrases first in that context. And this is where a phrase like, all the tribes of the earth will mourn, can throw us off. Many Christians who believe Jesus is speaking about his second coming in these verses understand the word earth here to mean planet Earth, implying a global event, one that would only be relevant to Christ's second coming. It's hard for modern readers to read it any other way, but the Church reminds us to understand terms in the time they were written for the audience it was written to. The Greek word for earth here is ys. It can be translated as the word earth, but the modern concept of global planet Earth was not its meaning in the first century. It has the sense of earth as in dirt, land in general as opposed to water, or a geographical region. It always depends on context to determine the best translation for any one verse. Modern English scholars have argued that English translations should be land rather than earth, simply because the meaning of the word earth in English has changed over the centuries to refer primarily to the globe in general. That's not its first century meaning. And when we look at the Old Testament, it's used most often to reference the geographical land of Israel, especially in passages that deal with the 12 tribes. If we use the word land, which captures the first century meaning better in a 21st century English vocabulary, this phrase would read, "All the tribes of the land would mourn." In our last video, we saw the elect who were being gathered in verse 31 referred primarily to the remnant of the 12 tribes of Israel. And this remnant of Israel were collectively called Jews in the first century. And so in that context, the primary literal sense of all the tribes of the earth, or land, will mourn, would refer to the Jews who would mourn over Jerusalem's destruction in 70 AD. For many Jews, the hope of a unified kingdom of Israel in Jerusalem under a political king ended with the city's destruction. Many Christians have forgotten the destruction of Jerusalem. But the mourning of the Jews for the temple's destruction and the loss of its covenant sacrifices still goes on today in the modern Jewish feast of Tisha B'Av. We covered that in our Great Tribulation video. The link is in the description below. Most of the imagery in these verses we've covered so far has been imagery of judgment. The imagery in verse 29 of the sun, moon darkening, stars falling from the sky, and heavens shaking point us in that direction. Verse 30, however, is a mixed bag. On one hand, there's the imagery of the Jews who would mourn over Jerusalem's destruction. And as we saw in a previous video, the imagery of the Son of Man coming on the clouds is a sign of judgment. But verse 30 is also about salvation. Because as we also learned, God coming on the clouds is also a sign of salvation. God comes on the clouds to judge, but also comes to save his people as well. And we see this transition to a theme of salvation in the imagery of verse 31, with the Son of Man sending out his angels with a loud trumpet call, gathering his elect from the four winds. These verses begin with judgment, but end with salvation. So too, the destruction of Jerusalem was both an event of judgment, but also one of salvation. Which brings us to our second question, namely, what is the meaning of the Son of Man sending out his angels? Who and what are these angels? It might seem obvious to a modern reader that this verse is talking about supernatural angels of God. But the Greek word angelos simply means messenger. It depends on the context to determine whether to pick the English word messengers or the English word angels. Formal or more literal translations of the Bible simply use messengers and leave the meaning ambiguous. It's helpful to remember that our modern English term angel does not refer to what angels are. Angels are spirits by nature. The Catechism teaches us that the term angel is the name of their office, meaning what they do. These spirits are called angels because of what they do. Angels act as supernatural messengers of God. So is Christ talking about sending out human messengers or supernatural messengers in this verse? In support of the human messenger interpretation, the Greek word for evangelize means to bring the good news. It has a root in angelos, meaning messenger. And isn't that how Christ draws his elect throughout time? By spreading the gospel through his human messengers? And as we've learned in this series, one reason the Great Tribulation was so great had to do with the timing of Jerusalem's destruction. Pilgrims faithful to the Old Covenant from all over the Roman Empire streamed into the city to gather for the annual Passover celebration as Titus was arriving with his troops. Titus allowed all pilgrims to enter Jerusalem, but none to leave. More than a third of the population of Jerusalem by then had already perished due to starvation and infighting among the false messiahs in control of the city. Citizens that refused to join the false messiahs were put to the sword. According to Josephus, over 1 million would perish in the siege of Jerusalem. And once Titus breached the city's walls and the desolation of Jerusalem and its temple was over, only 100,000 survivors remained. And so one meaning of sending out messengers is that the Son of Man would send out his human messengers primarily to the remnant of the 12 tribes of Israel. And human messengers preached the gospel to them. Human messengers had been doing that before the destruction of Jerusalem, of course, but those messengers encountered rejection and sometimes persecution from their fellow Jews. But you couldn't ask for better divine marketing support for those on the first century gospel sales team than the destruction of Jerusalem. And the pitch to those survivors and other Jews throughout the empire might have gone something like this. Our generation has experienced the greatest of tribulations. You've seen or heard that false messiahs brought about the destruction of our great city. You may be mourning the loss of many family and friends, and you might be wondering, what's next? Because with the destruction of the temple, the way we were to keep our covenant with God has seemingly passed away, which might be the scariest feeling of all. But you need not mourn forever. You may not know that the Messiah, the one we've waited for, has already come. He resurrected our old covenant into a new and everlasting one. He fulfills these sacrifices that were practiced in our temple in a new and better way. And if you remember the prophets, they promised there would be a new and everlasting covenant we were to be gathered into. So when you're ready, I'd like to invite you to a gathering we have every Sunday. We're currently calling our gathering the breaking of the bread. Although management is tossing around some new terms to better describe this gathering, we'll see what name management finally settles on. That's a hypothetical sales pitch, of course. But what we can tell from history is that the Christian community did go forth to their fellow Jews of the first century after the destruction of Jerusalem and preached the gospel to them. And they had remarkable success. And I know this is a long shot, a crazy idea maybe, but maybe we as modern Catholics could go forth in charitable confidence and extend others a similar invitation to Mass. We might have similar success. But for some reason, we modern Catholics don't seem to invite others into our amazing faith as much as we should. Maybe we think we don't know enough. But that's because we are often under the illusion that Christ depends on our theological knowledge to bring people to Him. Or maybe it's because of fear. We might believe that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, and all that's left to do is circle the wagons and wait for Christ's second coming. Many Christians seem to feel that way. But that's the opposite of what Christ actually teaches us to do to prepare for His second coming. All that is required is a charitable heart and a living out of a life of love in the Lord. It's a good spiritual exercise to reflect on why we might be hesitant to invite others to Mass and ask the Lord to help us. Meanwhile, good thing there's angels. Angels help pick up our spiritual slack. In support of the angelic messenger interpretation, the action of angels in salvation history is almost always invisible. The Catechism reminds us that Christ has made His angels the messengers of His saving plan. And the angels, like the human elect, participate in the life of the Church. Angels were the first messengers of the gospel. Visible angels announced Christ to Mary and to the shepherds in the fields of Bethlehem and to the disciples at the empty tomb. Angels are the invisible agents that through their watchful care and intercession draw all to Christ and His Church. And so another meaning of sending out angels is that the Son of Man would send out His angelic messengers to gather His elect. You can choose whichever interpretation you like better here, human messenger or angel. But remember, the Catholic answer is usually both, especially with ambiguous terms like messenger. Both aspects are true when we look at history informed by Scripture. It's fair to say, though, that the Church seems to favor the angelic messenger interpretation more. Maybe that's because the more we reflect on the events of Jerusalem's tribulation informed by Scripture, we approach the conclusion that there was an angelic hand in the salvation of those that survived and those that perished. And the Church has great hope for those that lost their lives in the Great Tribulation. She knows that the call of Christ sounds loudest during times of great suffering. She knows many heard his call and were welcomed by his angelic messengers into heavenly glory. And maybe the Church favors this angelic messenger interpretation also because there were what appeared to be visible angels in the sky in Jerusalem's last days. We'll cover those supernatural events in our next video, so make sure you subscribe. Which brings us to our third question, namely, what is this reference to a loud trumpet call? The imagery of angels and trumpets might bring to mind angels blowing trumpets to publicly announce the coming of the Son of Man. But read carefully. Who is blowing the trumpet? It's the Son of Man sending out his messengers with a loud trumpet call, not angels blowing trumpets. And if we read a little more carefully, we see a reference to a loud trumpet call versus just trumpets in general. And the main reference to a loud trumpet call in the Old Testament is the declaration of what was called the Jubilee year. You may have heard the term Jubilee used before in our Catholic faith. As part of the Old Covenant, the high priest was commanded to declare what was called the Jubilee year after every 49 years in the 50th year. The high priest was to announce with the loud trumpet and send out messengers to proclaim this loud trumpet throughout the land. This is found in Leviticus chapter 25. Then you shall send abroad the loud trumpet. You shall send abroad the trumpet throughout all your land, and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. There's a lot to this Jubilee year, but at least three main ideas for our purposes. First, and if your brother becomes poor and sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a slave. He shall be with you as a hired servant and as a sojourner. So there was forgiveness of the debt of slavery, which may have been voluntarily entered into due to economic circumstances. Secondly, and each of you shall return to his family. So there was a return to one's family that they had been separated from. And finally, each of you shall return to his property, meaning ancestral land. So there is a return to one's ancestral land that they had been separated from. Yet, as far as we can tell, this Jubilee year does not seem to have ever been proclaimed throughout Israel's history. And so Christ would come and fulfill the Jubilee in a radically new and better way. Through his passion, death, and resurrection, Christ would institute a true Jubilee for the release from our slavery to sin, restoration into the family of God, and a return to our true promised ancestral land, which is paradise itself. With the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the final barrier to those messengers to proclaim a Jubilee announcement to the elect would be removed. And so the primary literal sense of this phrase is that the true high priest, Jesus Christ, would send out his messengers to proclaim a true Jubilee to his elect, the remnant of Israel. And these promises, you shall return to your ancestral land, and each of you shall return to his family, are also fulfilled in a more radical way than most Catholics realize at each and every Mass. We've come a long way, and our hope is that you have a new appreciation for understanding the Bible from this Catholic approach. There's one last crucial image in these passages to look at, however, and that is, then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. To get the literal sense of that, we'll look at the incredible supernatural events surrounding Jerusalem's Last Days in our next video. If you have never heard about those, you'll be left wondering why you haven't. So if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to receive our latest videos as we publish them by clicking on the subscribe button. And don't forget to share this video with your family and friends. God bless.